Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little square of firelight in a country that seems too large for human beings. Not the clean log cabin from a calendar, not the cheerful wooden retreat with a tin mug, a wool blanket and snow falling politely outside the window. The world we are entering is darker than that, colder than that, and much less interested in anyone's frontier dreams. It is the Rocky Mountain fur trade world of the early 19th century, where winter could close the passes, freeze the streams, bury trails, silence animals, and turn an ordinary mistake into a very quiet disaster. A mountain man's cabin was not a rustic lifestyle choice. It was not built for charm. It was not built because someone wanted exposed beams and a good view. It was built because the human body is mostly warm water, and winter is very good at taking warmth away. And that is the first little fantasy we have to set down outside the door. The cabin was not proof that a man had conquered the wilderness. It was proof that he was still negotiating with it. Because when you look closely at how these shelters were made, the romance begins to leak out through the cracks, literally. Every gap between the logs mattered. Every missing smear of mud mattered. Every crooked roof pole, every lazy notch, every bad choice of campsite became part of the night. Coal did not need a doorway. It could enter through a finger-width mistake and spend the next 6 hours explaining itself. So tonight we are not just talking about cabins, we are talking about the body inside the cabin. Feet trying to thaw, hands stiff from chopping, smoke folding itself under a low roof, wet moccasins placed too close to the fire, meat hung where scavengers might not reach it, a man lying awake while the wind presses against the wall as if the whole forest is leaning in. And if you enjoy these slow walks into the uncomfortable corners of history, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always like imagining this strange little nighttime map of listeners, someone in bed, someone on a couch, someone working late, all of us gathered for a while around the same small historical fire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand is that many mountain men were not walking into winter with a full wagon of building supplies and a cheerful plan. During the Rocky Mountain fur trade, especially in the rendezvous years of the 1820s and 1830s, trappers moved with the seasons. They followed streams, hunted, traded, cached goods, lost animals, broke tools, made repairs, and survived by a mix of skill, experience, borrowing, bargaining, and luck. Some wintered near trading posts or in larger company camps. Others holed up in smaller parties, sometimes using teepees, brush shelters, caves, old structures, or whatever arrangement seemed least likely to kill them before spring. So when we say built cabins, we have to be careful. Not every mountain man built one. Not every winter shelter was a log cabin. Not every cabin was meant to last, and not every story told later by old trappers should be treated like a clean blueprint. Frontier memory has a habit of shaving off the embarrassing parts. Hunger becomes adventure. Bad planning becomes toughness. Smoke inhalation becomes atmosphere. Still, when timber was available and men expected to remain in one place long enough, a small log cabin could be worth the misery of building it. The decision began before the first tree fell. It began with choosing a place where a human body might remain alive. A good site needed wood, but not only wood. Wood for walls was one thing. Wood for weeks or months of fire was another. A cabin that took a day or two to raise might still require a small forest to heat badly. The men needed water nearby, but not so close that spring thaw or shifting ice turned the floor into a swamp. They wanted some protection from wind, perhaps a stand of trees, a bank, a fold in the land, but too much shade could keep snow deep and cold. They needed access to game, if there was any game left worth speaking of. They needed a place where horses or mules, if they still had them, might survive. They needed not just shelter, but a whole winter arrangement: meat, fuel, animals, water, traps, visibility, and escape. This is where the cabin stops being a cute object and becomes a system. The walls were only the part you could draw. Imagine the men at the edge of the timber, already tired before the real work begins. The axe is not a decorative prop here. It is the difference between an idea and a wall. A steel axe in cold weather has its own personality. The handle shocks the hand, the blade bites, glances, sticks. Chips jump into snow, breath steams. Someone's fingers go numb, then painful, then clumsy. The first logs are selected not because they are beautiful, but because they are close, straight enough, and possible to move. In a perfect little story, every log is carefully chosen and trimmed into obedient geometry. In an actual winter camp, good enough has a powerful vote. The men cut trees, limbed them, dragged them, rolled them, cursed them, and stacked them. If the cabin was small, that was not because the builders lacked imagination. Small was easier to heat. Small required fewer logs. Small meant less roof to hold under snow. Small meant the fire had some hope of making a difference. A grand room was for people with supplies, time, and confidence. Winter punished confidence. The corners were the heart of the work. Logs had to cross and hold. Different notching styles existed across frontier building traditions, but the purpose was simple: keep the walls from sliding apart while making the corners as tight as tools and patience allowed. A rough saddle notch could cradle one log over another. A more careful notch took time and skill. Too shallow and the logs sat badly. Too loose and the wind found its way in. Too ambitious, and a tired man wasted daylight trying to make wilderness carpentry behave like a town workshop. And daylight mattered. Winter days could feel insultingly short. You might spend the morning cutting, the afternoon dragging, and then notice the sun has already started to lower behind the timber, as if it had somewhere warmer to be. Once the wall logs were raised, the cabin still was not truly a cabin. It was a stack of wooden arguments with air between them. Those cracks had to be filled. This was chinking and daubing wedges, sticks, moss, grass, clay, mud, sometimes whatever material the place offered and the men could force into the gaps. The goal was not elegance. The goal was to stop the wind from entering with the confidence of an invited guest. Mud could freeze, clay could shrink, moss could loosen. A cabin wall was not finished once. It had to be watched, patched, and forgiven repeatedly. The crack between the logs is the small villain of this whole story. It is unimpressive in daylight. It does not roar. It does not charge. It waits until the fire drops low and the body has finally begun to relax. Then a thread of cold air slides through and finds the back of a neck, a wrist, a damp sock. Suddenly the cabin is not a fortress. It is a bargain with many loopholes. The roof made the bargain harder. A flat roof invited snow to sit heavily and think about becoming a collapse. A steep roof shed snow better, but took more work and materials. Poles might be laid across, covered with smaller branches, bark, earth, grass or mud, depending on what was available. In some places, hides or canvas could supplement shelter if men had them and could spare them. But nothing was magical. Bark curled, mud cracked, snow melted near heat, then refroze. Drips found faces in the dark with almost comic timing, because history enjoys humiliating anyone who thought they had solved water. The fireplace or hearth was another uncomfortable compromise. A fire inside could save you. A fire inside could also fill the room with smoke if the draught was poor. Chimneys made from stone, sticks and mud, or rough clay were common enough in frontier building, but a bad chimney was less a feature than a slow argument with your lungs. Smoke did not politely leave because humans preferred it that way. It tested the opening, rolled under the roof, stung the eyes, settled into clothing, blackened rafters, and made every blanket smell like last night's mistake. Still, when the fire caught, when the wall held, when the roof did not immediately sag, the cabin offered something no open camp could give, in the same way a pocket of survivable air. Not warm exactly. Warm is a generous word. Less deadly. That was often the achievement. Outside, winter had the whole continent to work with. Inside, men had a low room, a fire, stacked logs, mud in the cracks, and the hope that enough of their heat would remain with them until morning. The cabin did not make the wilderness gentle. It simply drew a rough line and asked the cold to stay on the other side. The cold, being cold, began looking for paperwork. It found the roof first. A roof in winter is not just something above your head. It is a decision made under pressure and then tested every hour by snow. If the pitch is too gentle, the snow sits there, growing heavier while everyone below pretends not to hear the little settling noises. If the roof is too ambitious, it asks for more poles, more labour, more daylight, and more confidence than a trapping party may have left. The mountain does not care if a man wants a handsome cabin. It cares whether he guessed the weight of weather correctly. So the builders worked with the shape of need. They laid ridge poles and rafters as best they could, covered them with smaller limbs, bark, grass, hides, clay, or earth, depending on the place and the season. A cabin roof might be ingenious and miserable at the same time. Bark could shed water until it curled. Earth could insulate until it became damp. Snow itself could become insulation, which is one of winter's little jokes. The thing trying to bury you could also help keep the wind off, provided it stayed where it belonged. Inside, the roof lowered the world. A small cabin meant less air to warm, but it also meant less room to breathe. Men who had spent months under the enormous ceiling of the sky could suddenly find themselves ducking under blackened poles, moving sideways around bedrolls, rifles, traps, packs, drying clothes and meat. The cabin was not a house in the modern sense. It was more like a wooden lung, trying to inhale warmth and exhale smoke without choking everybody inside. And smoke was never merely background. Modern people tend to imagine a fireplace as the warm heart of a room, the place where comfort gathers itself. But in a rough winter cabin, the fire was a demanding roommate. It wanted dry wood. It wanted draught. It wanted attention. It wanted someone to get up in the dark and feed it before the room slid back toward freezing. If the chimney drew badly, smoke thickened under the roof and softened every edge of the room. Eyes watered, throats scratched, blankets absorbed the smell, hair held it. Food tasted faintly of it. The men breathed the evidence of their own shelter. There is something almost insulting about that. You spend days cutting trees, hauling logs, lifting walls, smearing mud into cracks, and then the first thing your new home does is smoke you like a ham. But a smoky room was still often better than the alternative. Outside, wind could cut through wool and hide. Inside, even a bad fire gave a centre to the night. The men arranged their lives around it. Wet socks and moccasins went near it, but not too near, because leather could stiffen, shrink, scorch, or become useless in ways that revealed themselves at the worst possible time. Meat could hang in the rafters, unless smoke, heat, vermin, or hunger changed the plan. Guns and traps had to be kept where damp would not ruin them. Powder had to be protected. A tool lost in snow might as well have been dropped into the sea. The cabin's tiny interior became a map of priorities. The driest place was power. The warmest place was privilege. The corner out of the draft was luxury. Where a man slept told you less about romance and more about who got along with whom, who was ill, who had seniority, who had helped build the place, and who had annoyed everyone by snoring directly into the smoky air. The floor, if there was one, added another layer of compromise. Packed earth was faster. Rough split log flooring was better against damp, but it demanded more axe work. Either way, the cabin was not separate from the land. It was only the land rearranged. That rearrangement took strength the builders could not always spare. We should linger on the labour, because later memory often skips it. The finished cabin appears in stories as if it rose between one sentence and the next. Men arrive, men build, men survive. Very neat, very frontier, very suspicious. In reality, the work was repetitive, heavy, and dangerous in the ordinary ways that rarely make heroic legend. A dull axe made every swing more expensive. A slipping log could crush a foot or hand. Sweat was risky because wet clothing became cold clothing. Gloves, if worn, reduced grip. Bare hands gave better control until the cold took feeling out of the fingers. Even stopping was a calculation. Rest too long, and warmth left the body. Push too hard, and exhaustion made the next mistake easier. This is where the mountain man myth becomes too simple to be useful. Yes, many of these men were tough. They had to be. But toughness was not magic. It did not replace calories. It did not sharpen an axe. It did not make a horse easier to feed or a chimney draw properly. The most successful winter shelter was not made by attitude. It was made by judgment repeated until it became habit. And much of that judgment was borrowed, shared, adapted, or learned the painful way. The fur trade world was never only a world of lone white men striding nobly through empty mountains. That image is one of the great lazy paintings of American memory. The real world was crowded with relationships. Indigenous nations who knew those landscapes intimately, Métis and French-Canadian voyagers, Iroquois and other indigenous trappers, company employees, independent men, traders, interpreters, families, rivals, and allies. Knowledge moved through trade, marriage, employment, observation, and necessity. Shelter practices did too. Depending on place and circumstance, a teepee, brush lodge, hide shelter, trading post room, cave, or temporary lean-to could make more sense than a log cabin. A cabin was not always the smartest answer. It was the answer when the conditions made it sensible. Enough timber, enough time, enough tools, enough reason to stay, and enough people to make the work possible. Once the frame stood, the real winter life began, and the cabin revealed its true nature. It was not a finished object. It was a chore with walls. Every day asked for maintenance. Firewood had to be cut and hauled. The hearth had to be managed. Gaps had to be checked. Food had to be guarded. Snow might need to be moved away from the door. The roof had to be watched after heavy falls. Bedding had to be dried. Damp clothing had to be coaxed back toward usefulness. A cabin that was neglected did not dramatically collapse into tragedy at once. It slowly became worse. A little colder, a little wetter, a little smokier, a little more crowded with yesterday's laziness. And winter was patient. It did not need to win in one spectacular storm. It could win by making men tired. It could win by making wood harder to fetch. It could win by putting ice on the inside of the wall near a bad crack. It could win by turning one wet sleeve into a cough, one cough into weakness, one weak morning into a missed hunt, one missed hunt into thinner soup. That is why the crack between the logs matters so much. It is not just a flaw in construction. It is the place where the whole idea of shelter becomes visible. A cabin says we have made an inside. The crack replies, not completely. And somewhere in that answer is the true winter history of the mountain men. Not conquest, not romance, just tired bodies trying to make an inside strong enough to last the night. By the time the walls were standing, the cabin had already started making rules. This is the funny thing about shelter. People think they build it, and of course they do, with axes and logs and sore shoulders. But once it exists, it begins to build them back. A small room tells bodies where to sit, where to sleep, where to put wet boots, where not to breathe too deeply, where the smoke gathers, where tempers should not be tested unless everyone wants a long night. The cabin becomes a little government of heat. Heat is never democratic in a crude winter cabin. It has favourites. It pools near the fire, climbs upward, disappears through the chimney or the roof, and leaves the floor feeling like a colder country. One man may be sweating on the side facing the flames, while his back chills against a draught. Another may sleep near the wall and learn every missing lump of chinking by name. Someone will be too warm, someone too cold, and everyone will pretend this is better than being outside, because it is. But better than outside is a low bar. A cave full of bears could make a competitive argument in the right weather. The fire demanded fuel on a scale that modern comfort hides from us. Today, heat appears with a dial, a button, a quiet machine in the wall. In the mountains, heat came from trees, and trees had to be cut before they became warmth. Every hour of comfort began somewhere as a swing of the axe. This made firewood less like a household supply and more like a second winter job. The cabin did not simply need enough wood to cook supper. It needed enough to keep the interior from freezing hard through long nights, storms, illnesses, and days when going out for more was miserable or dangerous. Dry wood was another problem. Fresh green wood smoked badly and burned poorly. Dead wood might be buried under snow iced over, rotten, or too far from camp. Branches could vanish under drifts. A man did not just collect fuel, he calculated future misery. If the pile beside the cabin looked generous at noon, it could look small by midnight when wind was pushing through the cracks and the fire had eaten half of it. This is one of the less glamorous truths of cabin life survival, was logistics disguised as toughness. Food worked the same way. A cabin did not feed anyone, it only protected the men long enough for hunger to become more organised. Winter provisions could include dried meat, pemmican, flour, coffee, beans, salt, and whatever trade goods or hunted animals the party had managed to secure. But supplies varied wildly. Men near a fort or company post might have access to stores. Independent trappers far from help had what they carried, cached, killed, traded, or begged from circumstance. A cabin could hold food above the reach of some animals, dry strips of meat in smoke, shelter bags from snow, and give men a place to count what remained with increasing seriousness. Counting food in winter is a spiritual practice, but not the peaceful kind. Every meal contains arithmetic. How many days? How many men? How much work tomorrow? Is there game nearby? Are the horses eating enough? Can anyone spare strength for hunting? Is that meat truly sound, or is everyone agreeing not to smell it too carefully? Hunger changes the cabin's emotional weather. At first, the room is rough but companionable. Later, when stores thin, every casual hand near a food bag becomes interesting. Every scrap of fat becomes important. A man who wastes flour is no longer merely careless, he is dangerous, in a soft voice. The cabin, then, was also a storage device. It gathered things that could not be allowed to freeze, rot, disappear, or be stolen by teeth in the night. Powder needed dryness, firearms needed care, traps had to be repaired. Needles, awls, knives, spare flints, lead, cloth, tobacco, kettles and cooking gear had to be kept somewhere in the cramped interior universe. The smaller the cabin, the more every object became social. A misplaced axe was not clutter. It was a small crisis wearing the costume of plutter. And if there were animals nearby, the cabin's system extended beyond its walls. Horses and mules were not accessories, they were transport, wealth, status, escape, and sometimes the difference between mobility and being trapped in place until spring. Keeping them alive could become as important as keeping the men alive. They needed forage, shelter from the worst weather if possible, protection from predators or theft, and enough attention that a weakened animal did not quietly become the beginning of a much larger problem. A cabin with starving animals outside was not secure. It was just a warm box attached to a failing future. This is why wintering places were chosen with more than scenery in mind. A pretty valley could be a trap. A sheltered hollow could hold cold air. A timbered slope could offer fuel but hide danger. A stream could provide water but also ice, damp and difficult crossings. The landscape had to be read as a set of consequences. Mountain men, indigenous guides, hunters, and experienced travellers knew that beauty was not the same as survivability. Snow makes everything beautiful before it makes everything hard. Inside the cabin, daylight became a resource too. The door opened and closed with care because every opening was a brief surrender. If the doorway faced the wrong wind, entering the cabin could feel like inviting the weather in to inspect everyone. Doors were often crude, made from split planks, hides, or whatever could be fitted well enough to block most of the air. Most did a lot of work there. A bad door could flap, warp, leak, or freeze. A good door was not charming. It was a boundary that behaved. Windows, if present, were limited. Glass was precious and not something every remote winter camp could assume. Greased paper, hide, or small openings might admit a little light, but every opening also threatened heat. Darkness was cheaper than comfort. A cabin could spend much of the winter dim, with the fire making the main language of light orange on faces, red in coals, black shadows shifting over hanging traps and rafters, smoked into a permanent evening. The men themselves became part of the heating system. Shared space meant shared warmth, shared smell, shared irritation. Privacy was a luxury too large for the room. Wet wool, Leather, smoke, sweat, old grease, drying meat, and human bodies formed the cabin's atmosphere. Modern nostalgia rarely includes the smell because smell is where romance goes to lose an argument. Still, within all that discomfort, the cabin gave structure to time. Morning meant coaxing the fire awake, checking weather, stepping outside into a brightness that could hurt the eyes after the dim interior. Day meant cutting, hunting, mending, hauling, watching, repairing. Evening meant retreating into the wooden lung again, bringing the day's dampness and failures inside with you. Night meant listening to wind, animals, shifting snow, the breathing of other men, the crackle of fire dropping lower, and the small voice of cold entering wherever the cabin had not been properly persuaded. A cabin did not remove danger from winter, it gathered danger into chores. That may be the clearest way to understand it. Before the cabin, cold was everywhere. After the cabin, cold became the firewood pile, the mud in the wall, the roof load, the damp blanket, the ration bag, the animal outside, the smoke that refused to leave. The wilderness did not disappear. It became domestic. And domestic wilderness is still wilderness. It just waits beside your bed. The wilderness did not disappear. It became domestic. That sounds almost peaceful, until you picture what domestic meant in a winter cabin that had been made quickly, with tired hands, from whatever the country allowed. Domestic meant smoke hanging under the roof like a second ceiling. It meant damp wool steaming near the fire, with a smell that belonged somewhere between sheep, river mud, and regret. It meant boots or moccasins stiffening overnight if they were placed badly. It meant men waking in darkness because someone had let the coals sink too low and the cabin had begun to turn back into the forest. The body noticed these changes before the mind arranged them into thought. A sleeping man might feel one cheek warm from the embers and the other touched by moving air. He might wake with his nose cold, his throat dry, his blanket heavy with smoke, and one hip aching from the packed earth or rough bedding beneath him. If the cabin had bunks, they were simple. If it had only robes, blankets, hides, brush, or whatever could be layered against the ground, sleep became an argument with pressure points. There is a reason comfort becomes more interesting the less of it there is. A modern bed tries to erase the body. A winter cabin reminded the body of everything. The floor was not merely a surface, it was temperature. If made of packed dirt, it held dampness and cold. If covered with hides, robes, brush, or rough planks, it improved matters, but improvement is a broad word. Snow tracked in at the door melted near the fire, then spread into mud or froze again toward the edges. Ash escaped the hearth. Splinters found bare skin. Small lost objects vanished into shadow until urgently needed. Someone always seemed to be stepping over someone else's belongings because the cabin was too small for private disorder. And still, this was shelter. That is the hard mental adjustment. We want shelter to mean relief. In many cases, it meant reduced suffering. There is dignity in that, but not much softness. The cabin gave men a place to dry out a little, warm up a little, eat without the wind taking part in the meal, mend gear with fingers that could still bend, and sleep without snow collecting directly on their faces. It did not turn winter into home. It turned winter into a manageable series of irritations, which is not nothing. In some climates, a manageable irritation is the beginning of civilization. The day inside such a cabin often began before anyone wanted it to. Cold mornings have a way of making every movement feel like a negotiation. Someone had to tend the fire. If the coals were still alive, the morning had mercy in it. A few careful breaths, dry kindling, a small flame, and the room could begin again. If the fire had died completely, the whole day started with punishment. Flint and steel, charred cloth if available, tinder kept dry with religious seriousness, small shavings, cupped hands, patience. A cold cabin watching a man fail to start a fire is one of history's least supportive audiences. Once flame returned, the room changed slowly. Not instantly. No little wave of modern heat moved through hidden ducts. The fire worked locally, stubbornly. It warmed the kettle before it warmed the wall. It warmed the front of a man before it warmed his back. It made smoke before it made comfort. Men turned themselves before it like badly seasoned pieces of meat, one side toward relief, one side still in winter. Breakfast, if there was breakfast, depended on the condition of stores and luck outside. Coffee, when available, mattered far beyond taste. It was warmth, habit, alertness, trade, memory, and a small civilized lie told in the middle of a rough room. Flour could become cakes or rough bread. Beans required time and fuel. Dried meat could be chewed, boiled, pounded, mixed, stretched, resented, and blessed. Fat was precious because cold makes the body greedy for energy. A lean winter diet could leave men eating enough to keep moving, but not enough to feel fully alive. There is dark humour in how much wilderness survival comes down to housekeeping. The heroic image shows a man scanning the horizon with a rifle. The daily image shows him trying to keep mice out of the flour. And mice, if present, were not minor. Neither were weasels, foxes, wolves, bears in some seasons, dogs, birds, insects when weather allowed, or any creature that understood food as well as humans did. A cabin could protect supplies, but only if the supplies were placed intelligently. Hanging meat helped, caches helped, containers helped, watchfulness helped. None of it guaranteed anything. Hunger was not only inside the cabin. Hunger walked around outside wearing fur. The men had to leave the cabin constantly because the cabin consumed the world around it. Firewood did not walk indoors. Water did not politely arrive. Animals needed checking. Traps might need attention in seasons when trapping was possible. Meat had to be hunted, hauled, butchered, dried, or guarded. Repairs waited in every corner. A cabin could save life, but it also created errands, and errands in severe cold are not errands. They are exposure with a purpose. Opening the door changed the body's entire conversation. One moment the face is in smoke-warmed dimness, the next it is in air so cold it feels almost solid. Breath flashes white, eyelashes may gather frost. Snow reflects light with a kind of rude cheerfulness. The world outside looks clean in a way that makes the cabin seem filthy by comparison, but the clean world is also trying to kill you more efficiently. So a man steps out quickly. Maybe he carries an axe, maybe a kettle, maybe a rifle. Maybe he is simply going a few yards to relieve himself, which is another bodily fact frontier romance politely edits out. Every human need must pass through weather. There is no hallway, no lamp, no indoor convenience, no warm tile underfoot. The body is public to the cold. Inside, the cabin smells stronger after the outside air. Smoke, grease, leather, damp wool, unwashed bodies, old food, wet wood, ash. If hides are present, they add their own dense animal note. If meat is drying, the room becomes a smoky pantry with people sleeping in it. Modern noses might not last an hour before becoming dramatic. The men likely noticed less than we would, because life in that world came with smoke and animal materials everywhere. But familiarity is not the same as freshness. The cabin also shaped sound. Snow outside could muffle the forest until the world felt padded. Inside, small noises sharpened the shift of a log in the fire, the scrape of a knife, a cough, a muttered complaint, a boot knocking against a kettle, wind finding a seam. In a bigger house, irritation can spread out. In a winter cabin, irritation sits close enough to share a blanket. A joke could save the mood. So could tobacco. So could silence. So could going outside for wood before saying something that would make the next 2 months unbearable. Because this was not only a physical test, it was a social one. A cabin full of tired men in winter became an experiment in patience, with no one supervising but necessity. Everyone's habits enlarged in the cramped room. The man who wasted wood became more annoying every night. The man who smoked too much, snored too loudly, told the same story, took the warm spot, left tools wet, or failed to pull his share of chores, became part of the weather. In close quarters, personality becomes architecture. And yet cooperation was not sentimental, it was practical. One man could build a shelter, perhaps, if he had time and luck. but a group could cut faster, haul more, guard supplies, hunt in turns, tend fires, and keep watch on animals. Winter favoured cooperation, even among men who preferred independence. The famous free trapper may have treasured liberty, but liberty did not chop firewood while he slept. That is the deeper pressure inside the cabin. It gathered individual men into a shared system, whether they liked the system or not. The fire required labour, the wall required maintenance, the roof required trust, food required restraint, space required manners. Survival required the kind of discipline that does not look heroic because it is mostly small, repeated, and boring. The crack between the logs returned every night as a teacher. It taught that no wall was finished forever. It taught that warmth was temporary. It taught that the body could be humbled by an opening too small to notice at noon. And when the wind slipped through it in the dark, the cabin gave its most honest lesson. Indoors was not a place. It was an achievement that had to be remade every day. And because it had to be remade, not everyone entered winter with the same chances. The old frontier picture likes to flatten men into one broad shape: buckskin, rifle, beard, confidence, a little snow on the shoulders. But winter was not impressed by costume. It separated people by supplies, experience, alliances, animals, tools, employment, health, and luck. A man might look independent in a story and still depend on a chain of other people stretching far beyond the cabin wall. Some mountain men were attached to fur companies. Some had access to forts, trading posts, credit, stored goods, blacksmithing, trade networks, and larger wintering arrangements. Others worked in smaller parties with thinner margins. Some had horses, mules, extra blankets, axes in decent condition, kettles, powder, and provisions. Some had less. Some had partners who knew the country. Some had wandered into a geography they only half understood. One cabin could be backed by a trade economy. Another could be little more than desperation stacked into log form. That difference mattered in every inch of the room. A well-supplied winter cabin might still be smoky, cold, cramped and unpleasant, but it had options. Extra blankets meant the night was less sharp. A better axe meant more wood with less punishment. Flour, beans, coffee, salt and dried meat meant hunger could be postponed with some order. A sound kettle meant snow could become water without absurd difficulty. Spare moccasins or leather meant repairs before a foot turned into a crisis. A little tobacco could quiet nerves. A few tools could keep failure from spreading. A poorly supplied cabin was different. It could look similar from outside, the same square of logs under snow, the same smoke leaking into pale air. But inside, the arithmetic was crueler. Fewer blankets meant bodies crowded closer. Less food meant tempers watched the ration bag. Bad tools made every chore slower. Damp powder made the world more dangerous. Weak animals outside meant the whole party's future was shrinking. Poverty in a winter cabin did not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it looked like a man carefully saving a scrap of leather because tomorrow his boot might ask for it. Class in the mountains was often rougher and stranger than class in towns, but it did not vanish. Fur trade hierarchies travelled in packs, contracts, debts, and access. Company officers, clerks, hired hunters, trappers, voyageurs, interpreters, and labourers did not all stand in the same position, even if the cold blew through everyone's seams. The wilderness could humble rank, but it did not erase rank. A gentleman with frozen feet still had frozen feet. He might also have credit, authority, and men expected to obey him. An employee might have skill enough to survive and still be bound by debt, wages, or company discipline. Freedom, in this world, often came with a bill. The free trapper has become one of the favourite figures of American memory. Half businessman, half wanderer, a man who took orders from no one but weather and appetite. There was truth in that for some, but free trappers still needed markets. They needed buyers for pelts, sources for supplies, access to horses, ammunition, traps, alcohol, cloth, and metal goods. They could be independent in the way a person is independent, while depending on an entire trade system to make independence possible. The cabin might be lonely, but the economy inside it was not. Even the axe in the corner was a reminder. It did not grow on the mountain. It came from mines, forges, merchants, transport routes, credit systems and trade. The gun, the knife, the blanket, the kettle, the trap, the awl, the beads, the powder horn, the coffee if they had it, all of these carried distant labour into the cabin. The mountain man could stand alone in the snow only because many unseen hands had placed tools within reach. And then there is the knowledge that did not always get credited. Indigenous peoples were not scenery in the fur trade world. They were nations, families, trading partners, guides, rivals, hosts, teachers, diplomats and sometimes enemies, depending on time, place and circumstance. The Mountain West was not empty space waiting for bearded men to discover how cold works. It was inhabited land with deep environmental knowledge, roots, seasonal patterns, shelter traditions, food strategies, political boundaries, and meanings that outsiders often misunderstood or ignored. Many trappers survived because they learned from indigenous people directly or indirectly. They learned trails, foods, river behaviour, animal habits, weather signs, clothing methods, shelter choices, and the value of mobility. Some married indigenous women or Métis women, and those family ties could shape survival, trade, language, diplomacy, and daily life. Women's labour, especially in processing hides, preparing food, making and repairing clothing, managing camp materials, and sustaining households or travelling camps, has often been made nearly invisible in the heroic version of the story. But winter does not care whether later storytellers remember who did the sewing. A torn moccasin still needs repair. That is one reason the cabin myth can be misleading. It centres the man who swings the axe and forgets the web of labour that keeps a body alive after the wall is built. Cutting logs is dramatic. Maintaining clothing is less cinematic until a seam opens in freezing weather. Hunting looks heroic. Processing meat so it lasts is less glamorous until the fresh kill spoils or disappears. Building a cabin looks like survival. Keeping every small system functioning inside and around it is survival's quieter twin. The mountain man's body depended on materials that were often softened, stitched, scraped, tanned, dried, patched, carried, cooked, traded, and guarded by hands the myth leaves outside the frame. Gender entered the story differently depending on the camp. Some wintering situations were all male or mostly male. Others involved families, indigenous or mixed communities, trading post households, or women connected through marriage and labour to the fur trade. A cabin near a post, a lodge in a winter village, and a rough shelter used by a few isolated trappers were not the same domestic world. The past is always more crowded than the legend wants it to be. Law was also present, though not always in the tidy courtroom sense. Company rules, debts, trade obligations, territorial claims, indigenous diplomacy, informal camp discipline, and the threat of violence all shaped winter life. Who could trap where, trade with whom, travel safely, or claim supplies was not just a matter of personal daring. It depended on relationships and power. A cabin could feel remote and still be sitting inside overlapping systems of ownership, alliance, competition, and risk. Even location could be political. To winter in a valley was to enter someone's known landscape. To cut timber, hunt animals, graze horses, cache goods, or occupy a site could matter to the people already connected to that place. The old fantasy says wilderness means nobody's rules. History is less convenient. Often it meant rules the newcomer did not know until breaking them became expensive. Inside the cabin, these larger systems shrank into practical facts. Who had the better blanket? Who owned the traps? Who controlled the last coffee? Who decided when to move camp? Who knew the nearest safe route? Who could speak with nearby people? Who was trusted with powder? Who had the authority to settle a quarrel before it became a fight? In a cramped winter room, power did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it looked like the person everyone quietly depended on. And dependency is the word the romance dislikes most. The cabin seems to promise self-reliance. One man, one axe, one wilderness, one little house against the storm. But the closer we look, the more that picture breaks apart. The wall depended on timber. Timber depended on landscape. Fire depended on labour. Labour depended on food. Food depended on trade, hunting, storage, knowledge, tools, and restraint. The man depended on partners, animals, roots, materials, and often on indigenous knowledge the legend later pretended was instinct. So the cabin was never just a shelter from weather. It was a small wooden intersection where economy, class, gender, empire, trade, and local knowledge all met under a smoking roof. The crack between the logs widened here into something more than cold air. It became a crack in the story itself. Through it, you can see the parts of survival that the heroic painting leaves out. The hidden rule was simple, and it was brutal. Nothing in the cabin worked alone. A wall without fire was a wooden box full of cold air. A fire without fuel was a memory. Fuel without an axe was scenery. An axe without strength was iron with a handle. Strength without food was temporary. Food without storage became a gift to rot, mice, weather, or somebody else's hunger. Storage without discipline became a slow argument. Discipline without cooperation became one tired man trying to carry the whole winter on his back, which is a fine way to become part of the snow. This is why the cabin was never finished on the day it was built. The raising of the walls was only the loud beginning. The quieter work began afterward, and the quieter work was what decided whether the shelter remained a shelter. You can almost hear the cabin's demands if you stand inside it after the first hard storm. The roof wants attention. Snow has collected along one side where the pitch is poor. The chimney wants clearing or patching because the smoke is behaving badly again. The wall wants more mud pressed between two logs where yesterday's daubing cracked. The door wants adjusting because wet wood swelled and then froze. The floor wants sweeping, though sweeping here is not about neatness, it is about sparks. Scraps, damp, and not stepping on something sharp in the dark. The bedding wants drying, the socks want smoke and patience. The kettle wants water, the fire wants everything. A cabin in winter was a mouth. It ate wood by the armload, it ate daylight, it ate muscle, it ate sharp edges from tools. It ate the patience of men who thought, perhaps yesterday, that building the thing would be the hard part. A poorly planned cabin could consume so much effort that it became another danger. If the shelter was too far from good fuel, the men paid for that mistake every day. If it was too far from water, they paid in hauling. If it sat in a bad wind path, they paid in heat. If it was too large, they paid in firewood. If it was too low and smoky, they paid in lungs. If it was placed badly for animals, they paid in mobility later. Winter collected interest, and it charged the body first. Consider firewood again, because firewood is the most boring subject in the world, until it is the only thing between you and freezing. The men needed not a few picturesque logs stacked beside the door, but a working supply. Some had to be close enough for storms, some had to be dry enough to catch. Some could be larger pieces for long burning, some had to be small enough for kindling. Cutting it required judgment deadfall, standing timber, branches, resinous wood, whatever the landscape offered. Hauling it required time, stacking it required enough order that snow did not turn the pile into a buried puzzle. And every trip outside for wood opened the door, spilled heat, tracked snow, and reminded the body that the cabin's warmth was borrowed. Then came water. If a stream stayed open, that was a mercy with cold hands attached. If it froze, ice had to be broken, carried, melted. Snow could be melted, but snow is a cheat. It looks abundant, then collapses into a disappointing amount of water after stealing fuel to do it. Anyone who has melted snow learns quickly that winter offers plenty and then invoices you for the conversion. Water touched every system, drinking, cooking, cleaning. When cleaning could be managed, softening dried food, tending animals. Not enough water could become weakness. Too much moisture inside the cabin became damp bedding, frost, mould, rot, and the general feeling that the room itself had caught a chill. The men had to invite water in and then keep it from taking over. Food, meanwhile, required its own cold logic. Meat could freeze hard enough to become both food and object. Dried meat lasted better if it had been properly prepared and protected. Fat mattered, and cold made fat feel almost holy. Flour had to be kept dry. Beans had to be cooked long enough to be useful, which meant fuel. Coffee, if present, lifted morale out of proportion to its nutritional value, which is how you know it was important. Salt helped preserve, season, and comfort. A little sugar, if anyone had it, must have seemed like civilization arriving in a spoon. But the cabin did not simply preserve food by existing. It created decisions about where food belonged. Too close to heat, and it spoiled or attracted attention. Too far from heat, and it froze into inconvenience. Hung high, it was safer from some animals, but not all trouble. Cached outside, it might be protected from indoor damp, but exposed to thieves, scavengers, weather, or forgetfulness under snow. Stored inside, it made the room smell richer to every creature with a nose. The cabin's hidden rule kept repeating. Every solution created a new chore. A fire dried clothing, but too much heat could ruin leather. Smoke preserved meat, but smoke punished eyes and lungs. A tight cabin held warmth, but could become close and foul. A draughty cabin breathed better, but stole heat. A small cabin was easier to warm, but harder to share. A large cabin was easier to move in, but harder to heat. Snow on the roof could insulate, but also crush. Earth on the roof could block wind, but hold moisture. Mud in the walls blocked drafts, but cracked and fell away. There was no perfect answer. There was only a set of failures arranged in the least deadly order. That is frontier engineering at its most honest. Not elegant, not romantic, just a hierarchy of tolerable problems. And the men had to read those problems constantly. The best winter survivor was not always the strongest man in the room. It might be the one who noticed early, the one who saw the chimney smoking differently, the one who felt the floor getting damp near the wall, the one who checked the roof before the heavy snow became too heavy, the one who moved the moccasins before they hardened, the one who repaired a small tear before it became an exposed foot, the one who counted the woodpile without optimism. Optimism is lovely in spring. In winter, it can be a leak. So the cabin trained attention. It made men listen to objects. A change in the sound of the wind meant a gap had opened. A sour note in stored meat meant trouble. A horse standing dull and still outside meant another calculation had entered the room. A cough that lingered meant smoke, cold, damp, or sickness had gained ground. A tool left wet might not be ready when needed. A man too quiet might be tired, angry, hungry, or ill. And in close quarters, those differences mattered. The hidden mechanism of the cabin was not construction, it was feedback. The shelter spoke through discomfort. A draft told you where to patch. Smoke told you where air refused to move. Cold feet told you something about the floor. Spoiled food told you something about storage. Exhaustion told you something about distance from fuel. Irritation told you something about space. Nothing stayed abstract. Every bad decision came back as a physical sensation. That is why this history belongs to the body. A cabin was a theory of survival tested by skin, lungs, stomach, hands, and sleep. It also explains why people tolerated conditions that look awful to us. They were not comparing the cabin to a heated bedroom. They were comparing it to exposure. They were comparing smoke to wind, damp blankets to snow, a hard floor to frozen ground, thin soup to no soup, cramped company to being alone with a storm. The cabin won those comparisons often enough to matter. But it never won completely. At night, after the last chores softened into silence, after the fire settled into coals and the room turned red and black, the unfinished nature of the shelter became clear again. The logs creaked. The roof held or did not. The wind pressed along the walls, testing the work with invisible fingers. Somewhere, The crack between the logs waited for a little mud to loosen, a little moss to fall, a little shrinkage, a little neglect. And then winter entered, not as a grand enemy, but as a narrow thread of air. That was enough. A narrow thread of air could begin the whole collapse, not because cold air was dramatic, but because it was persistent. It found the sleeping places first. It slid under blankets, touched the damp edges of clothing, cooled the sweat that had dried poorly after the day's work. A man could wake and know, before opening his eyes, that some part of the cabin had failed in the night. Not failed spectacularly, failed in the ordinary winter way. A gap had opened. The fire had fallen low. The roof had dripped, the door had shifted. Something small had stopped doing its job. Small failures were dangerous because they travelled. A draught made sleep worse. Bad sleep made the morning slower. A slower morning meant the fire took longer to build, the animals were checked later, the wood was hauled with less strength, the hunt began after the best light had passed, and the mood inside the cabin grew thinner. Nobody needed to announce a crisis. The room could feel it. Men moved with that heavy quiet that comes when everyone understands the same problem and no one wants to be the first to say it. Winter did not always attack like a storm. Sometimes it simply reduced the quality of every decision. The roof was one of the easiest places for a mistake to become a chain. Imagine wet snow falling through the night, heavy and soft, the kind that looks almost gentle while it gathers. On a good roof, much of it slides or sits safely enough until someone clears it. On a bad roof, it loads one side, presses down on poles, melts near rising heat, seeps through bark or earth, drips into bedding, then freezes again toward the edges. The men wake not to disaster, but to dampness. That is almost worse. Because dampness does not always feel urgent enough to justify panic, but it quietly ruins everything it touches. A wet blanket is a private defeat. A wet powder horn is a public one. Damp bedding means colder sleep the next night unless it can be dried, and drying requires fire, space, attention, and fuel. Damp clothing means slower work. Damp leather stiffens strangely. Damp tools rust. Damp flour clumps and spoils. A damp cabin begins to smell sour beneath the smoke, as if the whole room is becoming tired of being itself. The men may joke about it because joking is cheaper than despair, but the problem remains. Water has crossed the boundary. The cabin is no longer merely holding winter outside, it is hosting part of it. Then there is smoke, the failure that looks like warmth's shadow. A bad draft in the chimney could turn a cabin into a place where everyone survives while being gently punished. Smoke stings the eyes, thickens the throat, and makes deep sleep harder. A man coughs. Another complains. Someone adjusts the fire. Someone opens the door for air, and cold floods in, which improves the smoke problem by worsening everything else. This is the cabin's sense of humour again. To fix one discomfort, you must briefly invite another. Over time, smoke could become so normal that men stopped thinking of it as an event. It lived in hair, beards, blankets, leather, bags, walls. It made the cabin visible before you entered it. But the body kept accounts, whether the mind did or not. Sore eyes, rough throats, headaches, restless sleep, and irritation all joined the winter ledger. The cabin saved the lungs from freezing air, and then filled them with smoke as a service fee. Food failures were quieter still. A bad hunt did not always mean hunger that night. It meant the future had lost weight. A cached supply spoiled or disappeared, and the room changed. Men might still eat, they might still talk normally, but a new arithmetic entered every glance at the stores. Flour that had seemed merely useful became precious. Fat became treasure. Coffee became a morale fund that might have to be spent carefully. Bones were boiled harder, scraps were saved, meals stretched. A man might chew slowly, not from manners, but because speed felt foolish. Hunger does not only shrink the belly, it shrinks patience. A joke lands badly. A small unfairness grows teeth. The warm place near the fire becomes more obviously desirable. The man who takes more than his share is no longer annoying. He is a threat dressed as a companion. In stories, starvation often arrives with drama. In a cabin, shortage might arrive as silence around the kettle. Animals could make the situation worse or better, depending on whether they lived. Horses and mules needed forage. In deep snow or hard weather, keeping them alive could become desperate. If they weakened, mobility weakened. If they strayed, were stolen, died, or had to be eaten in extremity, the men's world narrowed. A cabin without healthy animals could become less a base camp than a trap with a chimney. The men might survive the week and still lose the ability to move properly when movement became necessary. That is one of the hidden terrors of winter shelter. It can succeed too well. The cabin protects you, so you stay. You improve it, so staying feels reasonable. You store food, stack wood, make routines, patch cracks, settle into the little government of the room. Then the snow deepens, supplies thin, animals weaken, and the same shelter that kept you alive begins to hold you in place. Leaving becomes harder every day. Staying becomes riskier every day. The cabin does not ask which choice is right. It simply waits while the men argue with the weather. This is where judgment became cruel. Move too early, and you abandon shelter for exposure, uncertain routes, hungry animals, and storms. Move too late, and the cabin becomes a coffin with better lighting. Stay, and you need food and fuel. Leave, and you need strength and timing. The difference between prudence and disaster might be a week, a storm, one injured animal, one false hope that game would return. And injury changed everything. A cut from an axe, a crushed finger, a twisted ankle, frostbitten toes, a burn from the hearth, even a small infection could rearrange the cabin's labour. One man unable to haul wood meant another had to do more. One man unable to hunt changed the food plan. One man coughing hard through the night stole sleep from everyone. Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited, practical, and shaped by the beliefs and resources of the time. There was no clean clinic waiting behind the trees. There were bandages if available, herbs or remedies depending on knowledge, rest if the group could afford it, and the frightening hope that the body would repair itself faster than winter exploited the delay. The cabin made sickness intimate. No one could be ill privately. A fever heated one body and cooled the whole plan. A cough filled the room. A wound changed chores. Weakness became communal property. This could produce care, irritation, tenderness, resentment, fear, or all of them in the same hour. Survival rarely makes people saints. It makes them necessary to one another. That necessity could hold men together. It could also expose every fracture. A quarrel in summer can blow off down a trail. A quarrel in a winter cabin stays indoors and eats supper with everyone. Disagreements over food, work, risk, trade, alcohol if present, routes, animals, or leadership could become dangerous in close quarters. The same walls that kept out wind kept in anger. The same fire that warmed bodies lit faces too clearly. There was nowhere for pride to cool except outside, and outside had its own opinions. So men learned, or failed to learn, the discipline of not saying everything. They learned the value of small courtesies that later historians rarely record. Passing a tool without comment, taking the worst sleeping place one night, feeding the fire before being asked, not mocking a man who was frightened, because fear in winter was not always foolish, knowing when a joke could loosen the room, and when it would snap the last thread of patience. The cabin survived by wood and mud, but the people inside survived by restraint. That may sound too gentle for the mythology, but it is true in the practical sense. A winter cabin demanded emotional fuel as surely as firewood. Too much anger wasted strength. Too much pride made decisions stupid. Too much despair slowed hands. The men needed enough humour to keep from becoming bitter, enough caution to keep from becoming reckless, and enough honesty to admit when the little square of firelight was no longer enough. Because sometimes it was not enough. Sometimes the roof failed. Sometimes food failed. Sometimes illness came. Sometimes animals were lost. Sometimes the weather outlasted the woodpile. Sometimes the cabin remained standing, and the human system inside it began to break. The crack between the logs was only the visible one. The deeper crack opened between what a cabin promised and what it could actually give. It promised a room. Winter turned that room into a question. Could this place hold enough warmth? Could these men hold enough patience? Could the stored food last longer than the snow? Could the animals outside remain strong enough to carry everyone back into motion when spring made movement possible again? And then, sometime in the long middle of winter, the cabin changed. Not physically, or not only physically. The same logs stood there, the same roof sagged slightly under snow, the same hearth smoked when the air moved badly. But the men inside stopped seeing it as a project and began seeing it as a world. The rough edges became familiar. The low beam that struck a forehead once became something the body ducked without thinking. The draught near the back wall became a known enemy. The best place to hang damp socks became settled law. The sound of wind against each side of the cabin developed meaning, almost like a language. This is the renewal point of cabin life, if winter allows one. Not comfort, familiarity. Human beings can become used to almost anything that repeats. That is not always noble. It is simply one of the ways we survive. The first nights in a rough cabin might feel intolerable. Smoke, cramped limbs, hard bedding, bad smells, endless cold. But after enough days, the room begins to acquire a strange kind of intimacy. A man knows which log near the hearth catches slowly, which corner stays driest, which companion rises first, which story will appear when the kettle is nearly empty. Which silence means peace, and which silence means trouble. The cabin becomes memory before it becomes history. Small rituals form. Someone shakes snow from his leggings before entering, or is cursed until he learns to do it. Someone tends the fire with a care that begins to look almost affectionate. Someone checks the wall in the morning and presses new mud into a seam without making an announcement. Someone scrapes frost from a place where frost should not be, then says nothing because everyone already knows. A man might place his moccasins in the same spot every evening, not because he is tidy by nature, but because once he put them elsewhere and suffered for it. Survival is full of these tiny ceremonies. They are not poetic at the time, they are practical. But practicality, repeated under pressure, becomes ritual. The kettle at dawn, the wood brought in before dark, the door barred against wind, the fire banked carefully before sleep, the food checked, the powder kept dry, the roof listened to after a heavy fall, the animals counted, the cracks watched. In a better supplied cabin, these rituals might almost create coziness. A little coffee, a pipe, a story, the smell of meat warming in a pot, the orange light shifting over rough-hewn logs. Men who had spent the day in cold might feel real relief lowering themselves into the dim room. Outside, the world was blue, white, and iron. Inside, there was red light and human noise. That difference mattered. It could lift the spirit just enough to keep resentment from hardening. And we should allow that warmth its place. Not every hour was misery. History becomes false when it cannot admit moments of pleasure. A joke told well in a smoky cabin might be remembered for years. A hot mouthful of food after a brutal day could feel extravagant. Dry socks could produce gratitude as sincere as any prayer. A repaired boot could feel like a saved future. A calm night, with the fire drawing properly and the wind behaving itself, might make the whole world seem briefly manageable. The mountain men were not suffering statues. They laughed, they boasted, they sang sometimes. They told stories that likely improved with each telling. They gambled when they could, argued, mended, sharpened, planned, remembered, complained, and made fun of the same weather they feared. Dark humour thrives in places where people lack better furniture. But the laughter mattered because the room was hard. A cabin could become a theatre of small exaggerations. The cold was always the coldest. The snow was always deeper last year, unless this year was worse. The worst cook in the room became a public institution. The man who claimed not to feel cold was probably watched with private suspicion, because nobody trusts a person who lies that obviously. Humour did not erase danger. It made danger sit down for a moment. In this long middle, craftsmanship also became visible in a new way. The hurried decisions of construction began to show their character. A clean notch that held tight became a quiet blessing. A lazy corner required repeated patching. A well-placed hearth made the cabin livable. A bad chimney turned every evening into a smoked apology. A roof that shed snow well saved labour day after day. A poor roof kept reminding the men that haste had a memory. This is one of the best ways to understand frontier building. The quality of the work did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded through weather. A cabin might look acceptable on the day it was raised, and confess its sins gradually: here a leak, there a draught, here a sag, there a door that would not close properly, after damp and frost had taken turns with it. Winter was the inspector, and winter was not generous with passing grades. Yet the men learned from the structure even as it failed. Next time, if there was a next time, they would choose the site differently. Cut better logs, raise the sill higher, pitch the roof steeper, leave less space between wall logs, protect the woodpile sooner, build the chimney with more care. Not because a manual had corrected them, but because January had. The cabin was a schoolhouse where tuition was paid in discomfort. This learned knowledge is easy to romanticize, so it is worth keeping both truths in hand. Yes, experienced mountain men and frontier travellers developed impressive practical judgment. They could read weather, wood, water, animal movement, snow, and risk with a sharpness many modern people lack. But much of that skill came from being punished by mistakes. Wisdom in hard country is often pain that managed to become useful. And often, as before, that wisdom was shared across cultures. A wintering party's shelter choices could reflect native practices, French-Canadian experience, company routines, local materials, old European log-building traditions, and improvisations born in the moment. Nobody survived the mountains by pure originality. They survived by adaptation. They copied what worked. They abandoned what failed. They mixed techniques without caring whether later historians would know what to call them. By the middle of winter, the cabin also began to shape imagination. The outside world narrowed. Trails vanished. Distances became heavier. Spring existed, but more as a rumour than a season. A man might remember warm weather with the suspicion that he had invented it. The cabin door became a threshold between two versions of reality, the smoky, crowded, human one inside, and the enormous, silent one beyond the wall. At night, that threshold grew stronger. Firelight made the cabin feel briefly like the centre of creation. Outside, trees cracked in the cold. Snow shifted. Animals moved unseen. Wind passed over the roof with a hand that was never tired. The men could speak, laugh, curse, chew, mend and sleep, and still sense that the room was only a small interruption in something much larger. That awareness could be frightening. It could also be clarifying. Because the cabin's greatest gift may not have been warmth. It may have been proportion. Inside those low walls, men learned how little space a human being actually needs to remain alive, and how much work that little space requires. A few logs, a roof, mud in the cracks, fire, food, tools, companions who do not become enemies, a door that stays shut, enough luck to keep all of it from failing at once. The cabin did not make them masters of the wilderness. It made them students of limits. And by the long middle of winter, if they were fortunate, they had learned to stop asking the cabin for comfort and start thanking it for delay. That delay had a strange moral effect. It made everything feel temporary and permanent at the same time. Temporary because every man knew the cabin was only meant to carry them through a season, or perhaps through the worst part of one. Permanent because winter has a way of making a week feel like a small lifetime. The same logs, the same smoke, the same cramped sleeping places, the same rough door pushing back against the wind. These things began to feel less like shelter and more like fate. And the deeper contradictions slowly came into focus. The mountain man's cabin was supposed to be a symbol of independence, yet it made dependence impossible to ignore. Every object inside it contradicted the fantasy. The traps depended on metalwork. The rifle depended on powder and lead. The kettle depended on trade. The blanket depended on distant manufacturing or exchange. The moccasins depended on hide, skill, sewing, maintenance, and often indigenous or mixed cultural knowledge. The fire depended on trees. The men depended on one another, even if they grumbled about it. The cabin depended on the landscape, and the landscape did not depend on them at all. That is a hard lesson for any heroic self-image. A man could stand outside his cabin with an axe in hand and feel, reasonably enough, that he had carved his survival from the wilderness. But step back a little, and the picture changes. The axe came from somewhere. The knowledge came from somewhere. The trade routes came from somewhere. The right to occupy that valley, if anyone claimed such a right, was tangled in older indigenous presence and newer imperial hunger. The food came from animals, plants, labour, and luck. The cabin looked solitary only because the connections had been hidden by snow. Winter made the connections visible by threatening to cut them. A broken axe handle suddenly revealed the need for hardwood, skill, time, and a spare tool. A torn blanket revealed the need for needle, thread, hide, cloth, patience, and enough light to mend by. A shortage of powder revealed the entire cabin between a remote cabin and the wider economy. A sick horse revealed the dependence of men on animals that had no interest in being symbols of frontier freedom. A lost trail revealed the value of local knowledge more sharply than any speech could. The contradiction was not that mountain men were helpless. Many were astonishingly capable. The contradiction was that capability itself was social. Skill was inherited, traded, copied, taught, and corrected. Even the loner carried a crowd inside his methods. The cabin made that crowd visible in quiet ways. A man sharpening a knife at night might use a motion learned from another worker years before. A man patching a moccasin might rely on stitching he had seen done by someone whose name never entered a published adventure. A man choosing where to stack firewood might remember a winter when snow buried everything on the wrong side of camp. A man checking the chimney might remember another cabin where smoke made sleep nearly impossible. Survival knowledge did not arrive as revelation. It accumulated as scars, habits, borrowed tricks, and humiliations carefully not repeated. This is why the old stories of instant competence are so suspicious. No one is born knowing how to winter well in rough country. The wilderness is an expensive teacher, and it prefers practical exams. The cabin also exposed another contradiction: the men who sought open country often had to survive by entering the smallest possible room. The fur trade drew men into movement. Rivers, passes, trapping grounds, rendezvous, trading posts, hunting routes. The life was built around motion. And yet winter often rewarded stillness. It forced the moving man to become domestic. The trapper who spent warmer months ranging through wide spaces might spend winter measuring his world by the distance between hearth and door. A man who prized freedom might find himself governed by a woodpile. A man who disliked routine might learn that routine was what kept his fingers attached. There is something darkly funny in that, if we are gentle with it. The wilderness hero escapes civilization, only to invent chores immediately. Build the cabin, patch the cabin, sweep around the hearth, dry the socks, hang the meat, fetch the water, cut the wood, watch the roof, mind the animals. Do not waste food. Do not lose the axe. Do not leave the door open. Congratulations, you have fled society and discovered housekeeping with frostbite. But that humour points to something real. Domestic labour is often treated as soft because it happens near the hearth. Winter proves otherwise. The hearth can be a battlefield of maintenance. A cabin's survival depended on tasks that later storytelling might consider beneath notice. Cleaning ash, drying gear, mending seams, rationing food, tending fire, arranging space, keeping vermin away. These are not decorative details, they are the infrastructure of life. The mountain man myth loves the hunt. Winter respected the person who kept the kettle from freezing. This contradiction deepened when the cabin sat near or within broader communities. At trading posts, winter life could involve more complex households, storehouses, workshops, livestock, indigenous visitors and traders, mixed families, and social worlds that look nothing like the lonely cabin fantasy. Some men wintered in rough huts, some in fort rooms, some in lodges, some in temporary shelters, some in arrangements shaped by marriage and alliance. There was no single mountain winter. There were many, and the cabin was only one answer among several. But even in the loneliest version, the cabin forced a kind of society. 2 or 3 men in a small room became a social order. Who rose first? Who tended the fire? Who decided to hunt? Who cooked? Who repaired? Who complained? Who listened? Who held knowledge? Who owned the supplies? Who took responsibility when things went wrong? All of it mattered. A cabin could be too small for privacy, but never too small for politics. Power lived in practical control. The person who knew how to fix the chimney mattered. The person who knew the route out mattered. The person who owned the traps mattered. The person who could speak with nearby people mattered. The person who could make worn clothing useful again mattered. The person who stayed calm during a storm mattered. Rank, skill, temperament, ownership, memory, and usefulness all braided together. Winter rearranged respect. A loud man could become less important than a competent one. A proud man could become dangerous. A quiet man who noticed the roof sagging might save everyone. The cabin did not reward the same virtues as a campfire story. It rewarded attention, humility, endurance, cooperation, and the ability to do unpleasant things before they became emergencies. And there, the cabin's deeper contradiction becomes almost tender. It was built as a defense against nature, yet it required men to become more attentive to nature than ever. They had to notice wind direction, snow texture, animal behavior, fuel quality, moisture, thaw, freeze, daylight, cloud, smell, sound. The walls did not free them from the environment. The walls made the environment legible in smaller signs. A draft was weather translated into architecture. A drip was weather translated into bedding. A bad smoke draw was weather translated into lungs. A thin ration was weather translated into mood. The cabin turned the wilderness into messages the body could not ignore. That is why the little room deserves more respect than the romance gives it. Not because it was cosy, and not because it proved that one man could master a continent, but because it reveals a more honest survival, partial, borrowed, repetitive, uncomfortable, and shared. The cabin was both independence and dependency, freedom and confinement, skill and luck, shelter and warning. Outside, the snow kept smoothing the world into silence. Inside, the men kept proving that survival was not a single brave act, but 1,000 small acts that had to be done again before dark. The cabin stood between those two truths, holding them uneasily in its walls. And every time the wind pressed against the logs, the contradiction answered with a creak. That creak was not just sound, it was information. A cabin spoke in small complaints, and the people inside had to decide which complaints mattered. Some could be ignored, a little settling in the wall, a draft that had been there since the first week, a roof pole sighing under snow, but not yet bending in any frightening way. Other sounds carried a different weight, a sharper crack in the night, a sudden shift overhead, a chimney noise that meant smoke was about to stop leaving properly, a horse outside calling in a tone that made someone sit up before fully waking. The hidden cost of cabin survival was that rest was never complete. You could sleep, but not entirely. You could relax, but not beyond attention. The cabin gave shelter and then charged for it in vigilance. Someone always had to know the weather. Someone had to remember how much wood remained. Someone had to notice whether the stored meat was holding. Someone had to ask whether the animals were too quiet. Someone had to decide if the roof could wait until morning, or if men needed to climb into the dark and shove snow down before weight became disaster. This kind of attention wears on people, not dramatically at first. It thins them. It makes tempers shorter. It turns ordinary tasks into tests of character. A man who forgets to close the door quickly is not merely forgetful. He has let the room lose heat that others spent muscle earning. A man who tosses a damp hide in the wrong corner has created tomorrow's smell and perhaps tomorrow's mould. A man who takes the last dry kindling without replacing it has borrowed comfort from the future without asking. The future was always in the cabin, sitting quietly beside the fire. That is one of the reasons winter shelter could feel morally intense. Every action had a delayed consequence. The wood not cut today became the cold room tomorrow. The moccasin not patched tonight became the painful walk later. The food eaten too freely became the weak week ahead. The chimney not repaired became smoke when lungs were already tired. The crack not filled became frost inside the wall. The roof not cleared became a sound no one wanted to hear. In an easier world, carelessness can be hidden by abundance. In a winter cabin, carelessness stood up and introduced itself. And then there were the exceptions, the pressure points where the system could not simply be managed by discipline. A storm might trap men indoors for days. Heavy snow could erase trails, bury woodpiles, and make even short trips dangerous. Deep cold could turn every outdoor chore into a punishment. A thaw could be worse in its own way, softening snow, soaking materials, loosening mud, making paths sloppy, then refreezing everything into hard inconvenience. Weather did not stay in one category. It changed tactics. A cabin prepared for dry cold might struggle with wet snow. A roof that held powder might leak under melt. A woodpile stacked neatly in autumn could vanish under drifts if placed foolishly. A stream that had seemed perfect could freeze strangely, flood, or become difficult to reach. The best plan was still only a plan offered to a season that had not agreed to it. The men must have known this in their bones. Experience makes people less likely to trust a good morning too much. A clear sky can be temporary. Tracks can vanish. Game can move. Ice can betray. An animal that seemed strong yesterday can weaken overnight. A companion who seemed merely tired can become ill. Winter is very talented at turning "probably fine" into a phrase that sounds foolish afterward. Illness was one of the most difficult pressure points because it attacked the system from inside the people who maintained it. A cabin required labour, and sickness removed labour while adding need. Even a cold, a fever, digestive trouble, a lingering cough, or an infected cut could change the whole rhythm of the room. Someone who would have hauled wood now needed warmth. Someone who would have gone hunting now stayed near the hearth. Someone who would have slept through the night now coughed everyone awake. The cabin could become a sick room without changing shape. And medical care in that world was a mix of practical experience, inherited remedies, indigenous knowledge, European theories, personal trial, and whatever supplies survived the journey. Some treatments helped, some comforted, some did little, some may have made matters worse. We should not laugh too loudly from a world of antibiotics, sterile bandages and heated rooms. People did what they could with the tools and beliefs they had, but the body still judged the results without sentiment. A wound had to close, a fever had to break, a cough had to ease, a frostbitten foot had to remain useful. If not, the cabin's arithmetic changed. Frostbite especially belonged to the border between cabin and outside. It was a reminder that the shelter did not protect the work required to maintain the shelter. A man could keep his core warm enough by the fire and still damage fingers or toes while cutting wood, checking animals, hauling water, or travelling even a short distance in severe cold. The cabin saved him when he returned, if he returned in time, but it could not undo every exposure. Heat is not a moral reward, it is physics. And physics is famously poor at mercy. Burns were another cabin injury, less romantic but entirely plausible. A cramped interior, open flame, hot kettles, sparks, drying clothing, crowded movement, poor light, all of it made fire both servant and hazard. A man could be saved by the hearth and hurt by it in the same evening. Smoke, sparks and flame were not symbols. They were roommates with bad manners. There was also the pressure of boredom, which sounds too soft until you imagine it properly. Boredom in a winter cabin was not the modern boredom of having too many options and liking none of them. It was the boredom of being enclosed by danger. The mind wanted movement, novelty, distance, company beyond the same few faces. The weather said no. Work filled much of the day, But storms and darkness created long hours where men sat with thoughts that had nowhere to go. Stories helped. Repairs helped. Gambling, tobacco, singing, carving, cleaning weapons, planning routes, arguing over past events, remembering women and families and towns and rivers, all helped until they did not. A cabin could keep a man alive while making his world very small. The smallness did different things to different people. Some found steadiness in routine. Some grew restless. Some became sharp-tongued. Some withdrew. Some talked too much. Some drank if alcohol was present, which could warm the mood briefly and then damage judgment, health, supplies, or peace. The fur trade world had plenty of alcohol around trade and social life at times, though availability varied by setting. In a winter cabin, any substance that altered judgment was not just a private indulgence, it entered the shared system and took a seat by the fire. This is where dark humour has to be careful. It is easy to joke about men trapped in a smoky box getting on each other's nerves. And yes, there is something absurd about the whole arrangement flee crowded civilization, then spend winter close enough to hear another man digest beans. But the absurdity sits beside real strain. Isolation, hunger, cold, injury, and uncertainty could press hard on the mind. The cabin was shelter for the body, not always for the spirit. Letters, if anyone had them, must have meant more than paper. Memories of home could warm or wound depending on the hour. A man might think of a room with a real door, a mother's cooking, a wife, a child, a street, a church bell, a tavern, a field in summer, or nothing so gentle. Some mountain men had chosen the trade for wages, debt, adventure, escape, restlessness, or lack of better options. The cabin did not ask why they came, it only asked whether they could remain useful. That demand was relentless. Stay useful, keep moving, patch the gap, cut the wood, stir the pot, share the work, check the animals. Do not waste heat, do not waste food, do not waste courage on performances nobody needs. By this point, the cabin has become almost the opposite of the modern fantasy. We imagine it as a refuge from life's demands. For them, it concentrated life's demands into one room. Every object had a job. Every habit mattered. Every failure had a smell, a temperature, a sound, or a hunger attached to it. And still, when the storm rose outside and the walls held, gratitude could be real. That is the strange balance. The cabin could be miserable and miraculous at the same time. It could smoke your eyes, chill your back, bruise your hip, sour your clothes, trap your patience, and still be the only reason morning found you breathing. It could fail in a dozen small ways and still succeed in the largest one. The hidden cost was that success never felt final. It had to be earned again at dawn. And dawn, in that kind of cabin, did not arrive as a golden promise. It arrived as a faint change in the darkness, a grey pressure around the door, a colder awareness in the room. The fire had either survived the night, or it had not. The men had either slept enough to become human again, or they had only borrowed unconsciousness for a few hours. Someone opened his eyes and listened before moving, because winter mornings taught the body to take inventory before spending strength. Is the wind still up? Is the roof quiet? Is anyone coughing too hard? Did the animals make it through? Does the room smell wrong? That last question mattered more than modern people might think. Smell was information. Smoke was normal up to a point. Damp was normal up to a point. Old leather, bodies, ash, drying meat, grease and cold wool were all part of the cabin's ordinary atmosphere. But a new smell could mean spoiled food, wet bedding, sickness, rot, an animal problem, or something burning too close to the hearth. In a world without alarms, gauges and bright electric light, the nose worked overtime. The first movements were small. A man shifted under a robe or blanket. Someone coughed into the smoky air. Someone muttered at the cold with the exhausted intimacy of a person greeting an enemy he knows too well. A hand reached toward clothing that had stiffened in the night. Boots or moccasins had to be persuaded onto feet. Nothing about this was cinematic. It was the daily indignity of survival before a man could face the wilderness. He had to win an argument with his own footwear. If the fire was still alive, the room had little mercy left in it. Coals could be opened, fed, breathed into, encouraged. Kindling caught. A kettle could be set near the heat. The first glow began to separate faces from shadow. Men who had been lumps under blankets became people again, slowly, and not always pleasantly. If the fire was dead, the morning had teeth. Cold ash meant work before comfort. Tinder had to be found and protected from clumsy hands. Flint and steel had to do their small, stubborn business. The man making the fire became the most important person in the world for several minutes, which is to say he became the target of everyone's silent impatience. No one wants to rush the person trying to return heat to creation, but everyone does it privately. This was the human cost that rarely appears in the clean old image of the mountain cabin. The steady wearing down of the body through repetition. Not one dramatic night, but many ordinary mornings. Not one blizzard, but the daily work of refusing to become weak. Hands cracked, lips split, smoke roughened throats, eyes reddened. Knees ached from cold floors and awkward labour. Shoulders carried the memory of logs, water, meat and wood. Feet became the centre of private anxiety, because a damaged foot could turn a capable man into a burden faster than pride could accept. The body became a ledger, and every chore wrote in it. Cutting wood wrote in the shoulders and palms. Hauling water wrote in the back. Sleeping badly wrote behind the eyes. Hunger wrote in the temper. Smoke wrote in the cough. Cold wrote in the joints. A winter cabin did not preserve the body untouched. It spent the body slowly in order to keep the body alive. That sounds bleak, but it is also the truth of many human shelters before modern comfort. Houses were not always places where discomfort ended. Often they were places where discomfort became organised. The cabin organised cold into zones near the fire, near the wall, near the door, under the roof, by the floor. It organised hunger into meals, rations, and waiting. It organised fear into chores. It organised exhaustion into routine. It gave suffering a schedule. And schedules can save people. A man who might collapse under vague dread can sometimes endure a list. Feed the fire, melt water, check the animals, patch the gap, cut wood, boil something, mend the strap, sleep if possible, do it again. The rhythm did not make the winter kind, but it made it answerable. The men did not have to defeat the whole season in their minds. They had to get through the next task without making the next task harder. Still, the cost remained. The cabin demanded a narrowing of attention. Big dreams shrank to practical wishes. Dry socks, a clean draught through the chimney, a little fat in the pot, a roof that held, a morning without new trouble, a companion who did not start an argument before coffee. Hope became modest, and modest hope may be the most honest kind. There is a tenderness in that, if we are willing to see it. These were not marble heroes standing above discomfort. They were men with sore backs and bad mornings, trying to keep their hands useful. They were hungry sometimes, bored often, frightened more than they probably admitted, and dependent on skills that could fail them. Their cabins were not monuments, they were attempts. Each one said in wood and mud, "We would like to live until spring." That is not a small sentence. The people who knew winter best did not always speak of it grandly. They respected it because they had been corrected by it. A person can brag about summer. Winter listens longer. The cabin's occupants learned that survival was less about dramatic courage than about small obedience to reality. Bring in the wood before the storm. Dry the gear while you can. Eat with tomorrow in mind. Do not trust a roof because it held yesterday. Do not ignore a sick animal. Do not pretend cold cannot enter because you are tired of patching the wall. Reality is dull until it is ignored. The human cost also included memory. A hard winter stayed in the body after it ended. Men who had slept in such cabins likely carried forward an instinctive respect for dry wood, good boots, solid roofs, and reliable companions. They may have joked later about the smoke, the cold, the bad food, the man who snored, the day the door froze, the night someone nearly burned a moccasin beyond saving. Humour turns misery into property. Once you can tell the story, it belongs to you a little more. But not every memory softened into comedy. Some winters took friends, animals, health, teeth, toes, strength, or confidence. Some cabins were remembered because they held, others because they nearly did not. Others perhaps because someone was left behind in the story, unnamed, under snow, or in a grave too simple for romance. We do not need to make this graphic to make it serious. The seriousness is already there. Severe cold does not require decoration. Hunger does not need theatrical language. A man unable to rise and help with morning chores is a complete sentence. A companion silently taking his share of work tells you enough. And that may be the deepest human fact inside the cabin's survival was shared unevenly, but it was shared. One person's weakness became another person's labour. One person's skill became another person's chance. One person's mistake became everyone's cold night. One person's steadiness could keep the room from fraying. The cabin made this impossible to hide. Its smallness forced the truth into the open. Nobody survived as an idea. They survived as bodies among other bodies, all of them needing heat. By late winter, if the men had endured, the cabin itself must have seemed almost alive with what they had given it. Smoke darkened the beams, grease marked places near the hearth. The floor held tracks of boots, ash, mud, and habit. The walls carried patched cracks like scars. The roof sagged in its own tired way. The door remembered every storm. It had sheltered them by being repaired again and again, and they had survived by becoming, in some rough way, part of its maintenance. That is where evidence becomes both useful and frustrating. We want the cabin to stand still for us. We want one perfect example, a typical mountain man cabin, with exact dimensions, exact tools, exact roof, exact hearth, exact smell, exact misery, all neatly labelled. History refuses. The fur trade world left records, but not always the records a tired modern listener wants at midnight. Journals note travel, trade, weather, conflict, meetings, prices, animals, losses, and occasional details of camp life. Later memoirs tell better stories, which is exactly why they must be handled carefully. Archaeology gives us traces, hearths, post holes, cabin remains, artifacts, stains in soil, the stubborn little debris of lives that did not know they were leaving clues. But a winter night inside the cabin rarely preserved itself whole. So we work from fragments. We know log structures were used in many frontier and fur trade settings, where timber, tools, time, and purpose made them practical. We know winter camps varied. We know some men lived near forts or posts, some in smaller camps, some in lodges, brush shelters, tents, caves, or mixed arrangements depending on region and circumstance. We know that the Rocky Mountain fur trade was not a single lifestyle, but a shifting world of companies, independent trappers, indigenous nations, mixed families, trade routes, labour systems, and seasonal movement. We know cabins existed, but we also know the cabin must not become a lazy symbol for everyone. The popular version is cleaner than the evidence allows. That does not make the cabin less interesting. It makes it more interesting, because uncertainty forces us to ask better questions. Instead of asking, what did the mountain man's cabin look like? As if there were one answer, we ask, what problem was this shelter trying to solve? That question survives regional variation. It survives missing measurements. It survives unreliable bragging. It brings us back to the body. The problem was exposure. Cold air took heat from skin. Wind stripped warmth faster. Wet clothing became dangerous. Snow buried supplies and slowed movement. Fire required fuel. Food required protection. Men required sleep. Animals required care. Tools required dryness. Smoke required escape. A cabin, if built, was an answer to those problems, but only a partial answer. That much we can say with confidence, because no matter what the exact cabin looked like, the human body had not negotiated special terms with winter. The body was the same vulnerable machine everywhere. Warm blood, thin skin, tired muscles, lungs that disliked smoke, feet that disliked freezing, stomachs that disliked emptiness, tempers that disliked all of the above. Some details, though, must remain cautious. We should not declare that every mountain man used one style of notch, one roof method, one chimney design, or one interior arrangement. Building traditions moved through European-American frontier practices, French-Canadian experience, indigenous knowledge, local invention, and plain necessity. Men used what they had. A group with more tools could do finer work. A group in a hurry did rougher work. A camp near a fort differed from one deep in the mountains. Timberline, snow conditions, available clay, stone, bark, grass, hides, and the length of intended stay all changed the answer. A cabin is not just architecture, it is local weather translated into wood. That is why later illustrations can mislead. They often show the cabin as a complete thought square, firm, picturesque, smoke rising bravely, mountains behind it. But a cabin in use was more like an ongoing argument. It had repairs, stains, sagging places, missing bark, patched cracks, smoky corners, and improvised shelves. It was a verb pretending to be a noun. To say, they built a cabin, sounds finished. To live in one was to keep building it with every day's labour. The sources also carry bias. Many written accounts came from men connected to trade, travel, exploration, or later storytelling. They often cared more about movement, danger, deals, or memorable incidents than about the routine work of drying socks. Ordinary maintenance rarely receives the dignity of ink. Women's labour, indigenous expertise, and the contributions of people outside the heroic frame were frequently under-recorded or filtered through outsiders' assumptions. A document may mention a successful winter and omit the hands that made clothing hold together. It may mention a cabin and omit who taught the builders which valley was safe, which fuel burned well, or which weather sign meant trouble. Silence in the record is not absence in the world. Archaeology helps, but it has its own limits. Wood decays, temporary structures vanish, later occupation disturbs earlier remains. A hearth can tell us a fire burned there, but not every joke told beside it. A rusted nail or trap part can tell us material culture, but not whether the man who used it had slept badly for 3 nights. Soil can hold the outline of a building, but not the emotional temperature of men trapped inside during a storm. Evidence gives us a frame. Imagination fills the room, but responsible imagination must keep its boots on the ground. So when we reconstruct the cabin, we should do it humbly. We can picture logs because log construction was real. We can picture chinking because gaps in log walls were real. We can picture smoke because open fires and rough chimneys were real problems across many early shelters. We can picture damp, cold, cramped space and labour because those follow directly from the materials and conditions. But we should be careful with exact claims. Not, the mountain men always did this. Better, in many timbered wintering places, men might do this. Not every cabin was miserable. Better, even a successful cabin could be smoky, cramped and demanding. Not, they lived alone by pure skill. Better, some men survived through skill, but also through trade, partnership, indigenous knowledge, tools, animals, and luck. The truth is messier, and therefore more human. There is also a mythology problem. The mountain man became a cultural figure larger than the historical workers themselves. Later America wanted him to stand for freedom, masculinity, self-reliance, expansion, and a kind of rough innocence. That figure is useful for posters and campfire branding. It is less useful for understanding winter. Myth removes the boredom because boredom sells badly. It removes dependency because dependency complicates the pose. It removes indigenous presence because the old national story liked empty landscapes. It removes smoke because smoke makes the hero squint. A real cabin puts all of that back. It says, here is the freedom you admire, and here is the woodpile that makes it possible. Here is the independence, and here is the trade kettle. Here is the lonely man, and here are the methods he learned from other people. Here is the wilderness, and here are the political boundaries the myth forgot. Here is the heroic winter, and here is the cough in the morning. This does not make the mountain men smaller, it makes them more real. Real people are always more interesting than symbols, because symbols never have to patch their roofs. By late winter, a cabin that had worked well enough would have accumulated evidence of the season in every surface. Smoke on the rafters, mud repaired in layers, a doorway worn by boots, bits of hide, cord, wood shavings, ash, bone, and broken gear. The place would not look like an illustration of survival. It would look used. That is the most honest historical texture of all. Used means the cabin mattered. Used means it took damage instead of the people taking all of it. Used means the men trusted it, cursed it, repaired it, and depended on it. Used means the wall did not have to be perfect to be precious. Used means the crack between the logs could be patched badly in the morning and still become the difference between misery and danger by night. Evidence may not give us every voice inside the room. It may not preserve every winter exactly. But it gives us enough to reject the clean fantasy. It gives us enough to see the cabin as a working compromise, shaped by environment, trade, culture, memory, and bodily need. And once we see that, the myth loses some shine, but the little room gains weight. That weight did not vanish when the fur trade changed. The old mountain cabin kept living in memory long after many of the actual structures rotted into soil, burned, collapsed, or were swallowed by later settlement. Logs decay, legends harden. The cabin, once a rough answer to cold, became something cleaner in the American imagination, a symbol of beginnings, self-reliance, masculine grit, frontier virtue, national expansion, and the comforting idea that a determined person with an axe can make a life anywhere. There is truth hiding inside that symbol, but it has been washed until the smoke is gone. The cabin became cozy because later people could look at it from a safe distance. Distance is a powerful carpenter. It straightens the walls, it dries the floor, it sweetens the smell. It removes the cough, the damp blanket, the mouse in the flour, the bitter argument over firewood, the fear of a roof beam shifting under snow. It leaves the golden firelight and forgets what the fire required. Modern nostalgia loves the cabin as escape. Leave the city, go to the woods, sit by the stove, listen to snow, drink something warm from a mug that has never had to be defended from freezing. The image is not evil, it is pleasant, because modern shelter has done its job so well that we can afford to romanticize older shelter. We can visit cold as an aesthetic because, for most of us, cold is no longer the government. For the mountain men, cold governed everything. That difference matters. When we admire a log cabin today, we usually admire the look of hardship without the obligations of hardship. We admire visible wood, but not the daily cutting. We admire rough walls, but not air leaking through them. We admire candlelight, but not the lack of light. We admire the fire, but not the smoke, the ash, the fuel, the burns, the mornings when the coals died. We admire simplicity, forgetting that simplicity often means every comfort has to be personally negotiated with the material world. A cabin is simple, in the same way a loaf of bread is simple if you ignore the field. The legacy of these winter shelters also shaped later frontier building. Settlers, soldiers, traders, miners, ranchers, and homesteaders all used versions of log construction where timber was available and conditions made it practical. But those later cabins were not identical to the mountain men's winter shelters. Some became more permanent homes. Some had families inside them, cultivated fields around them, roads nearby, neighbours within reach, or legal claims attached to the ground. Some were still miserable. Some became comfortable by the standards of their time. The log cabin was not one thing. It was a form adapted to many pressures. That is why the mountain man cabin should not be confused with every frontier cabin that came after it. The fur trade winter shelter belonged to movement as much as settlement. It was often tied to seasonal survival, trapping, hunting, trade access, temporary occupation, and the need to hold out until movement became possible again. Its meaning was not, "we are founding a town." Often it was closer to, "we are trying not to die before the thaw." That sentence changes the walls. The cabin's modern echo is also tangled with politics. In American memory, the log cabin became a badge of humble origins. Politicians used it, families cherished it, communities preserved it. The image of a person rising from a cabin to greatness became a national story, especially in the 19th century. A rough wooden house could stand for honesty, labour, natural virtue, and distance from corrupt luxury. But symbols are selective. They ask the cabin to speak of self-made men, and rarely ask whose land the logs stood on, whose knowledge made survival possible, whose labour was unpaid or unremembered, whose absence made the scene look emptier than it was. The cabin became a national stage prop because it seemed morally simple. The real cabin was not morally simple. It sat inside trade networks that transformed landscapes and animal populations. The fur trade was tied to global fashion, imperial competition, indigenous diplomacy, disease, debt, alcohol trade in some contexts, violence, alliance, marriage, dependence, and environmental change. A beaver pelt taken in a frozen stream could travel into markets far beyond the mountains. A cabin built for winter survival could be part of a system reaching to hat shops, counting houses, treaty grounds, and political ambitions. That does not mean every man inside the cabin saw the whole system clearly. Most people live inside systems larger than their daily imagination. The trapper cutting wood may have been thinking only about his hands, his supper, his traps, his horse, his debts, or the weather. But history has the advantage of distance. We can see the cabin as both intimate and global, a smoky little room connected to fashion in cities, credit in company ledgers, indigenous territorial politics, and the appetite of empires for skins, roots, and influence. A crack between the logs could open onto the world. At the same time, we should resist turning the cabin into nothing but a symbol of expansion and damage. That would flatten the people inside in a different direction. They were not only agents of empire or characters in a national myth, they were also cold, hungry, skilled, foolish, funny, exhausted, adaptive, lonely, dependent, and sometimes brave in ways too ordinary for monuments. They were workers in a dangerous economy, making decisions with incomplete knowledge in a world that could punish hesitation and arrogance alike. History becomes more honest when people are allowed to be many things at once. The cabin's legacy, then, is double. It is part of a myth that needs correction, and part of a human record that deserves respect. We can reject the clean fantasy without mocking the real labour. We can question the romance without pretending the shelter was unimpressive. Building a winter cabin with limited tools in severe country was difficult. Living in one required endurance. Maintaining one required intelligence. The problem is not admiration. The problem is admiration that forgets what it is admiring. If we admire only rugged individualism, we miss the system. If we admire only the picturesque logs, we miss the smoke. If we admire only survival, we miss the cost. If we admire only freedom, we miss dependency. If we admire only the man with the axe, we miss the people, animals, trade routes, materials, and knowledge standing behind him. The cabin asks for a better kind of attention. Not louder attention, quieter attention. The kind that notices a patched seam in a wall and understands that someone woke cold enough to fix it. The kind that sees a blackened rafter and understands that warmth came with smoke. The kind that sees a low door and imagines a tired man ducking under it after carrying wood through snow. The kind that sees a rough hearth and understands that a fire is not ambience when it is your only argument against the night. That kind of attention changes the cabin from scenery into evidence. It becomes evidence of how much work shelter used to be, evidence of how thin the line was between indoors and outdoors, evidence that survival often depended not on one heroic act, but on maintenance repeated past boredom, evidence that human beings are clever, but not invincible, evidence that every comfort has a history of someone doing the unpleasant part. And maybe that is why the image still holds us. Not because the cabin was cozy in the way we want it to be, but because it makes comfort visible. It shows us walls before walls became invisible. It shows us heat before heat became automatic. It shows us shelter before shelter became assumed. The old cabin is not a fantasy of simplicity. It is a reminder that simplicity can be brutally complicated when the world is cold enough. So when the modern mind pictures that little log structure under snow, it should keep the firelight. Yes, firelight mattered. But it should let the smoke remain too. It should let the roof sag a little. It should let the door leak air. It should let the men inside be more than legends and less than superheroes. The cabin was not a postcard from freedom. It was a receipt. A receipt for warmth paid in wood, for independence paid in trade goods, for silence paid in loneliness, for firelight paid in smoke, for survival paid in the daily surrender of comfort. And by the time spring began to loosen the hard edges of the world, the cabin would have told its full truth. It had not defeated winter. It had endured being used against winter. There is a difference. Defeat sounds clean, final, triumphant. Endurance is dirtier. Endurance leaks, cracks, coughs, patches, curses, and keeps going anyway. The cabin was not a victory monument. It was an exhausted arrangement that had lasted long enough. Spring did not arrive all at once. Not in the mountains. It came first as suspicion, a different softness in the afternoon light, snow that crusted hard in the morning and weakened by noon, water speaking under ice, a smell in the air that was not exactly warmth, but the rumour of thaw. The roof began to drip more often. Paths around the cabin turned from packed snow to mud. The same ground that had been frozen into obedience started making its own opinions known. The cabin, which had spent winter trying to keep water out, now had to face water in another form. Melt. Melt is less dramatic than a blizzard, but far less polite. It finds low places, it seeps under doors, it softens floors, it loosens earth roofs, it wakes rot, it turns ash into paste and paths into ankle-deep inconvenience. Snow that had helped insulate a wall might now hold damp against it. The world did not simply become easy because the cold had weakened. It changed problems. But change itself was hope. The men could begin to imagine movement again. Animals, if they had survived in useful condition, mattered more than ever. Gear had to be repaired, sorted, packed, judged. What could be carried? What had to be abandoned? What was worth saving? What had winter ruined? A cabin that had felt like the whole world in January could suddenly become temporary again. Its walls remained, but the mind began stepping beyond them. That leaving must have carried mixed feelings. Relief, certainly. Restlessness. Practical anxiety. Maybe even a little attachment to the awful place. Human beings are strange that way. A room can punish you for months and still become familiar enough to miss, or at least to remember with a softness it did not earn at the time. The beam that hit your head, the hearth that smoked, the corner that never warmed properly. Once you are leaving, even these can become part of the story you own. The cabin had watched them become smaller, rougher, more careful versions of themselves. It had held their bad moods, their hunger, their jokes, their coughing, their repairs, their private fears. It had heard the exaggerations told after supper, and the quieter sounds no man would boast about later. If a person slept badly in the same place long enough, the place became intimate. Not pleasant, intimate. And before departure, there would be the practical question. Leave the cabin standing, improve it for return, strip it for useful material, abandon it to weather, or burn what had to be burned. Different circumstances produced different answers. A shelter near a known route might be used again by the same men or by others. A rough wintering hut might simply decay. A more established post structure might remain part of a larger system, but a lonely cabin in the mountains did not retire gracefully. It entered another season of negotiation, this time without its builders inside to defend it. Unwatched cabins fail quietly. Mud falls from the cracks, roofs sag, animals enter. Snow loads one side, rain finds weaknesses. Logs rot where they touch damp ground. Grass grows near the sill. The door, if there is one, loosens. The hearth fills with debris. Smoke stains remain long after the last fire. The building slowly returns to the landscape it had interrupted. A cabin is a human argument made from natural materials, and nature has unlimited time for rebuttals. That image should stay with us. The abandoned cabin after winter, no longer heroic, no longer cosy, just used. It reminds us that survival structures are often temporary sentences written into a place. Some are preserved because later people decide they matter. Most disappear. The mountain west is full of absences, camps without walls, shelters without roofs, winter nights without names, labour without monuments. The famous figures survive in books. The ordinary arrangements that kept them alive often become stains in soil, scattered metal, old hearthstones, or nothing visible at all. And yet the disappearance does not make them unimportant. Most human history is made of things that did not last. A meal, a fire, a repaired seam, a night of sleep, a choice to stack wood before dark, a wall patched badly but soon enough. These are not grand artifacts. They are the little acts that keep the future open. That is the final insight the cabin offers before we leave it. It makes survival look less like bravery and more like maintenance. Bravery may be needed in flashes, but maintenance is needed constantly. Maintenance is humble. It has no dramatic soundtrack. It does not pose well. It is a person doing the necessary thing while tired, then doing another necessary thing after that. It is not glamorous to bring in wood. It is not legendary to dry socks. It is not thrilling to check stored food, patch a crack, clean a hearth, or fix a strap before it breaks. But winter respects maintenance more than it respects legend. The old mountain men who lasted were not merely men who could face danger, they were men who could face repetition. They could endure the boredom of staying alive. They could keep doing small things, because the alternative was not a large dramatic failure, but a slow narrowing of chances. A cabin made that lesson visible in wood. The modern world hides much of our maintenance from us. Heat comes through vents. Water comes through pipes. Roofs are built by specialists. Food arrives through systems so vast we barely see them. We can forget that comfort is not natural. Comfort is organised. Comfort is maintained by someone, somewhere, often out of sight. The winter cabin strips that illusion away. It puts heat, water, food, shelter, waste, sleep, illness, and cooperation back into one smoky room where nothing can be outsourced very far. That is why it still feels powerful. Not because we want to live exactly that way. Most of us would last about one smoky, freezing night before becoming deeply philosophical about central heating. But because the cabin shows the bones of shelter, it shows what a wall is for. It shows why a roof matters. It shows how fragile warmth can be when it has to be made by hand. It shows that the line between outside and inside is one of the oldest human achievements, and also one of the easiest to take for granted. By now, the cabin under snow should look different from the one we entered at the beginning. It should not look like a fantasy retreat. It should not look like a symbol polished clean by myth. It should look small, dark, necessary, imperfect, and alive with labour. A low roof under weight, smoke struggling upward, mud pressed between logs, a door that fits well enough, a woodpile disappearing faster than anyone likes, men inside, not conquering winter, but answering it. One chore at a time. And as spring loosens the frozen ground, the final meaning begins to gather around that little structure. It was never the opposite of wilderness. It was wilderness rearranged just enough for human breath. That is the phrase worth carrying back out of the trees. A cabin was not a little kingdom carved from nature. It was not a declaration that winter had been mastered. It was a fragile arrangement of the same forest that surrounded it, trees cut and stacked, earth smeared into cracks, stones gathered into a hearth, bark or poles held above tired heads, smoke from burning wood looking for a way back into the sky. The cabin was the wilderness, persuaded into a temporary shape. And inside that shape, human beings tried to remain human. That may be the most moving part of the story. Not the axe, not the rifle, not the snow piled high against the walls. Those images are strong, but they can become too easy, too clean. The deeper image is quieter. Someone waking before dawn because the fire has sunk low. Someone adding wood with stiff fingers. Someone pressing mud back into a crack he has patched before. Someone listening to another man breathe and wondering if the cough is worse. Someone counting what remains of the food without letting fear enter his voice. This is not the frontier of posters. It is the frontier of maintenance. And maintenance is where reality lives. The mountain men who wintered in such places were not all alike, and their shelters were not all the same. Some had better resources, some had company support, some drew on indigenous knowledge, mixed communities, trade relationships, old building habits, and skills learned by failure. Some were reckless, some were careful, some were lucky. Some were remembered because they survived long enough to tell stories, and some, surely, disappeared into the kind of silence history rarely knows how to fill. But the cabin helps us see them less as legends and more as bodies. Bodies needing warmth, bodies needing fat, bodies needing sleep, bodies coughing in smoke, bodies made proud by skill and humbled by weather, bodies that could travel enormous distances and still be defeated by wet socks, bad judgment, or a roof that did not shed snow. This is not an insult to them, it is a form of respect. Symbols do not feel cold, people do. A myth asks us to admire distance. A cabin asks us to come close. Close enough to smell damp wool. Close enough to see how low the ceiling is. Close enough to understand why the warmest place in the room might become a small source of politics. Close enough to notice that the wall is not smooth, that the chinking is uneven, that the roof is not an architectural statement but a survival wager. Close enough to hear the fire settle and know that if no one feeds it, the night will begin taking the room back. The old cabin also changes the way we see comfort now. A heated room becomes less ordinary when you remember that warmth once had to be cut from trees, hauled by hand, split, stacked, guarded from wet, coaxed into flame and watched through the dark. A dry blanket becomes less ordinary, a tight door, a clear chimney, a floor that does not freeze the feet, a roof that does not need to be listened to with suspicion. The modern world can make comfort feel invisible because it works so smoothly. At least when it works. The winter cabin makes comfort visible again by showing every joint in the system. It tells us that inside is one of humanity's great inventions. Not inside as luxury, inside as survival. Inside as the place where wind is slowed, heat is held, food is protected, tools are dried, the sick are watched, and the body can stop bracing itself for a few minutes. Inside as a fragile human agreement with matter. Inside as a line drawn against weather, never permanent, never absolute, but meaningful enough to save a life. And still, that line was thin. That is why the crack between the logs has followed us all the way through. At first it was just a construction problem, a gap to be stuffed with moss, grass, clay, mud, chips, whatever the men could find and press into place. Then it became a draft on the neck, a cold wrist under a blanket, a little failure in the wall. Then it became a sign of everything the cabin could not fully do. It could not end winter, erase hunger, remove smoke, guarantee peace, or make one man independent of all others. By the end, the crack is not only in the cabin. It is in the myth. Through that crack, the clean old picture lets in air. The lone hero becomes a worker inside a network. The cosy cabin becomes a difficult machine. The wilderness becomes inhabited land, traded land, contested land, known land. The fire becomes labour. The shelter becomes compromise. The whole story becomes less shiny and more alive. That is usually what happens when history becomes honest. It loses polish and gains weight. So let the final picture be quiet. A low cabin stands at the edge of timber after a long winter. Snow still holds in the shadows, but the thaw has begun. The roof drips steadily. The door hangs rough but serviceable. Smoke no longer rises because the men have gone, or are preparing to go, or perhaps are standing outside deciding what the season has left them. Near the wall is a woodpile diminished to awkward pieces. Around the doorway the snow is trampled into mud. Inside the rafters are blackened. The hearth is grey. The floor is marked by boots, ash, grease, and months of small decisions. Nothing about it is picturesque if you look too closely. That is why it matters. The cabin did not make men free from nature. It made them answerable to nature in a smaller room. It did not turn hardship into romance. It turned hardship into chores. It did not prove that one determined person could stand alone against the world. It proved almost the opposite, that survival depends on tools, knowledge, materials, timing, restraint, cooperation, and the humility to patch a small failure before it becomes large. Winter did not need to be defeated for a cabin to matter. It only needed to be delayed. Delayed through one more night of coals kept alive, one more gap packed with mud, one more armload of wood brought in before dark, one more kettle thawed, one more roof watched, one more tired man choosing to do the necessary thing before lying down. That is not a dramatic kind of courage, but it may be the kind most of human life has depended on. The mountain cabin, then, is not a monument to conquest. It is a monument to enough. Enough wall to slow the wind, enough roof to hold back snow, enough fire to keep the hands useful, enough food to meet the morning, enough patience not to turn the room against itself, enough knowledge to notice what is failing, enough luck that the failures do not arrive all at once. And when the fire burns low in that last imagined night, when the men are sleeping under smoke-dark beams and the wind is moving outside through the timber, the cabin keeps making its small argument. Not loudly, not perfectly, just enough. A mountain cabin did not conquer winter. It persuaded winter to wait outside for a while.